guys, Teresa here. Welcome back to Lost My Thread. We are back here today with part 3 of the Troublesome T-shirt Tussle. If you are new and haven't watched part 1 and 2 of the series, I would recommend it, and I'll put a link up here so that you can check them out. In the first video, I was just telling you about which patterns I chose and why, and telling you which fabrics I've chosen to pair with them. In part 2, I was actually looking at when you order the pattern, what you get as far as value for money, different options, size range, and what the patterns are like to piece together. So really everything from browsing a website to the point where you're ready to start sewing. In part 2, at the top of the leaderboard was the Gable top by Jennifer Lauren Handmade. In second place, we had the Concord Tea by Cashmere, and at the bottom of the leaderboard at that point was the Classic Tea by Love Notions. But everything can change, absolutely. There's no reason that's going to be the final winner at the end of it. Today is really going to be about the sewing. I want to tell you what it was like to actually put these patterns together, what the instructions were like, what the sewing process was like, and we will see who's at the top of the leaderboard at the end of today. Now, I would class myself as an intermediate sewist. I've been sewing for quite a while, but I wouldn't say that I'm an expert. I am definitely beyond the beginner stage, but I remember what it was like to be a beginner, particularly when sewing with knits, because I haven't been sewing with knits that much over my years, and I've been doing a bit more in my more recent times, and I've been learning quite a lot now. But I do think a t-shirt, basic t-shirt pattern should be a beginner-friendly pattern. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that as a beginner, but you need good instructions that are going to spell out how to sew with knits in particular. So I wanted to look at what these different patterns did as a good baseline. The one that disappointed me the most was the Love Notions Classic Tea. I felt like that pattern didn't really make it feel like they understood you were sewing with knits, to be honest. There was no instructions, special instructions about how to sew with knits. They never once told you to use a zigzag stitch if you're using a normal sewing machine. They didn't mention about potentially using a serger, which obviously you can do with knits, and that works great. You can use a standard sewing machine though. You just need to use a little bit of adaptation, for example, using a zigzag stitch when you're sewing the seams. I think it wasn't helped as well. The illustrations in the directions, they showed what looked like a straight stitch. So when I was first sewing with knits, I sewed with a straight stitch. I'm probably not the only person who did that because I didn't know. And if they don't tell you, how are you going to know? You're going to learn by basically finding that your seams, they just pull out over time as that woven or as that knit fabric stretches. It's going to pop those seams. So I learned that the hard way. I feel like Love Notions Classic Tea, if you're not going to know to do that in advance, you're going to find out the hard way too, which is a pretty disappointing way to find out about it. As a comparison for the Concord Tea by Cashmere, they told you to use a very specific width of zigzag stitch. So they say if you're sewing with a normal sewing machine, use a zigzag. They gave you numbers for the length and the width, which I thought was really helpful. They recommended using a ballpoint needle, which is going to help to pierce through the jersey fabric more effectively. And they told you to press the seams after you do like a neckband, for example, to make sure that it sits nice and flat. I feel like those are really great basic knit instructions. You really don't need a lot. It's a couple of sentences, but it means that if you are new to sewing with knits, you're going to know what you're doing right from the off. The Concord Tea instructions also clearly showed a zigzag stitch for the seams, which I thought was really, really helpful if you're in doubt. For the Jennifer Lauren Handmade Gable top, there was a whole section in the instructions that was titled Sewing with Knits, so that you're definitely knowing that you're getting that basic information. Same kind of stuff, it said to use a narrow zigzag stitch. Didn't give you numbers for the length and width, but it did show that, or it said you can use a lightning stitch, and it had illustrations of each so that you know what she's talking about. It also recommended a ballpoint needle, and it did also specify potentially adjusting your presser foot pressure, which I think can be quite useful depending on if you have quite a lightweight jersey. I feel like sometimes those can get pulled into the bottom of the machine, and it's just nice to have that little bit of extra recommendation. I would say her photos or the illustrations do look like a straight stitch, but I feel like if you've read that previous bit about sewing with knits, you know that that's just the seam, and you know that you need to stitch that in the way that's been recommended. I feel like on the whole, I actually was pretty satisfied with all of these different sewing patterns instructions, so I'm going to get into some more of the details, but I feel like on the whole, I do like all these 3 pattern companies. I feel like they really clearly illustrate all the steps as they go along. None of the steps were confusing or unclear to me. Obviously, these are basic garments, but I have had success with these sewing patterns with more complex garments as well. But I want to get into some of the specific instructions and how they varied across the patterns, just because I think it's useful to compare who gives a little bit more of a helping hand and a little bit more of an explanation. One of the things that I think is useful to consider is whether or not to stabilize the shoulder seams. And in most sewing patterns where you are making a top or a dress, they will recommend that you stabilize this shoulder seam. And basically what that means is putting something into that seam that's not going to stretch as much as your fabric to stop this fabric from overstretching and pulling and sagging over time. The Gable top by Jennifer Lauren Handmade just says, carte blanche, stabilize your shoulder seams, and I feel like that's probably good advice rather than taking any chances. They recommend that you put a piece of clear elastic against the inside of the back seam where it's going to join at the shoulder before you attach the back to the front. And that is a basic good way to make sure that that shoulder seam is stabilized. The Love Notions Classic Tee says that you might want to stabilize that shoulder seam if your fabric is delicate or drapey or a bit thin. And I think that's good advice in general, but I would say that it doesn't tell you how to do it. It doesn't tell you where to put that elastic. And if you're a beginner of sewing with knits and you haven't made a shirt before that's like a basic t-shirt, you're really not going to know how to do that. As far as the Concord Tea by Cashmere, they do tell you how to do it. They tell you to actually put this clear elastic into the inside of the back shoulder seam as you're attaching it to the front, and you stitch it all together at once. I feel like that works for me and I didn't have any issue with that, though maybe if I was a beginner I would prefer to stitch it in place first, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that instruction. I think that works really well, and like I said, I didn't have any issues with it. The only thing is they say that that elastic, again, it's that clear elastic you're stitching in, that it's optional, but they don't tell you why you might want to do it. Like when is the option going to be suggested? So it feels a little bit like guesswork, to be honest with you, and I think it would have been nice to specify. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is when I would choose to use clear elastic or when I would not. So I think it's worth noting that I don't think that the thinness or delicacy of the fabric is necessarily all that I'm considering. I think the weight of the fabric is probably a bigger factor for me. So if it's more of a heavyweight jersey fabric, so I'm thinking things like bamboo are quite heavy, tencel jerseys are quite heavy, they are going to pull everything down, and those are the shoulder seams that I'm more worried about getting stretched out over time, and those are the times I would make sure that I'm going to be stabilizing that shoulder seam. Also, if you're going to be making a dress, anything that's going to be heavier, again, is going to pull even more, those are the times it's going to be particularly critical. I think if it is super thin and delicate, I think that is fair. I probably would want to stabilize it as well. And I think it's not a bad idea just to do it, like I said, to be on the safe side. But I feel like it's good to spell out those particular times you would want to if it's going to be suggested. So I want to show you some of the details and actually show you these shirts. Now, I'm not going to put them on until the next video, so we're not getting into the fit or any of that. It's just about the construction and the finish. And I'm going to start by telling you a bit more about the Concord Tea. This is the Cashmere Concord Tea. There were some things that I loved about it, some things that I didn't love. On the whole, I will say it was a very satisfying shirt to put together. One of the things that they had more than the other pattern companies is a lot of notches. I do enjoy a good notch. I appreciate a good notch to help to make sure that you're lining everything up together. Particularly, I would say along this side seam when the fuller bust section, remember these are shirts that are designed for a fuller bust, when that's joining to the back, you want to make sure that everything's lining up where it should to make sure that it's not going to be pulling and distorting things out of shape. So there were loads of notches along the side seam. The neckband as well, they actually had 4 notches. So a lot of sewing patterns will tell you to mark the front and the back of a neckband and then fold it in half and mark with a pin where those other kind of quarters of the neckband are, and then match that up with the shirt neckband, or the neckline rather. But for this one, they actually had marking points that were meant to match with the shoulder seams in addition to the front and the back of the shirt section. Having said that, they did just give you a standard neckband length, and when I was trying to put that in, I think my neckband is honestly a bit too short. I think it really is going to depend on the fabric, depending on the stretch of your jersey. There's not a standard neckband length. in reality, and you will find that some sewing patterns, they end up a bit too big or too small, and you might even make the same pattern with 2 different fabrics and have a different result for that specific reason. They're all going to have a different amount of stretch and give when you're trying to fit them into a neckband piece. But I wanted to try and make it, as the pattern suggested, to be a kind of fair comparison, and I'm sure they'll all be totally wearable. But when I used the notches that they had for the neckband and I tried to pull them, they are clearly trying to get the front of the neckband to pull a little bit tighter so that it sits flat against your chest, whereas the back section is going to be a little bit flatter. And when I did that, I literally couldn't even stretch the neckband enough to get it to match the shoulder seams. It was too short for that. So what I ended up doing was actually marking my quarter points like I would do on a normal sewing pattern, and marking where a quarter point is from front to back and from each side. And that's where I matched everything up. It's not the flattest, and again, you know, whenever I've got black fabrics, I know this is always going to be really tricky to see, so you might not be able to see particularly. It's not completely flat, it's a little bit, I would say, bunched up there at the front of the neckband, but I have a feeling when I wear this and it pulls on my body, it's going to sit really flat. I have pressed this as well. I was trying to get these as flat as I possibly could. I think the back of the neckband is a bit flatter. It's not 100% perfect. It's really not bad though, and I'm pretty happy with that. As far as top stitching over the edge of the neckband, they tell you here that you can do a zigzag stitch, you can do a twin needle, or you can do a cover stitch if you have one. I don't have a cover stitch. Twin needles, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with, so I went for a zigzag on this one, and I think it looks overall good. The other thing that this pattern had that the other ones didn't that I want to mention was the little sleeve tab option. So it had an option that you can roll up what looks like a little buttoned on sleeve tab that you've rolled up your sleeve, and I think that's a cute detail, and I decided to use a contrast button on here, so I'll show you what it looks like. I will say that I feel like that came together really well. The instructions were great. It was a little bit more of a, you know, an extra step, but I felt like they held my hand along the way, and it has a really nice finish in the end. I think it looks really cute. So I'm going to show you, this is my little contrast button. This is a faux sleeve band. So this is no buttonhole here. You just stitch the button onto the top of it. It does go onto the inside, so you will see it's a proper fold in from the inside. So it is a little loop there, but it's not a proper buttonhole. But I think that's a really sweet detail on the shirt, and I'm glad that I added that on. It's a nice little extra that that pattern had. And like I said, the instructions were really great for that element. For most of that as well, they used straight stitches rather than zigzag stitches to give you really nice, neat lines, and that's not going to pull and stretch. And I really appreciate when a pattern company understands knits and they can appreciate why you want to use a zigzag and when you want to use a zigzag, and don't just have rules about you must use zigzags all the time. They're being clever with it, and I appreciate that. The Gable top by Jennifer Lauren Handmade is a bit different because it doesn't have a neckband. It has a different neckline detail. And again, this one, it was really nice to put together. I really enjoyed the process of the constructions, really enjoyed following along with the different stages. Because of the difference in the neckband, something that Jennifer Lauren recommends I really like is that you try the shirt on before you sew on the side seams, just to make sure that you like the neckband where it's sitting. So the design of this one is it has like a straight slash neckline, and it is meant to be quite up high on your neckline, but a lot of people don't feel that comfortable with it being so high, so you can try it on and then fold it down further if you prefer that neckband to sit a little bit lower. She does give you instructions depending on how much you're bringing it down. If you're bringing it down quite significantly, it might just affect how that everything lines up along the shoulder seam, and she gives you instructions on how to adjust for that. So I feel like it was really nice and clear, and I do enjoy that detail. I feel like she's thinking about the person making it. She wants to make sure that they're happy with the garment and they're going to wear it in the end. So trying it on as you're going is a really great tip to make sure that that is going to be comfortable and wearable for you. She also recommends adding something onto the back of the shirt, because as many shirt patterns are, this one is not very easy to tell the front from the back when you're pulling it out. I will say the front does sit a little bit No, sits the same actually when I line it up properly on my hanger. Yeah, there's no obvious front and back, but the front and back pieces are different, particularly because this again is made for someone with a fuller bust size. So I appreciate that she tells you to add a little label on the back. She says you can just put a little piece of ribbon, but you know, I've got sewing labels. I think they're cute. I'm gonna throw one of those on there. The way the neckband is made is a little bit different because it is the slash neckline and you're gonna be folding this section over from the front to the back and stitching it down. This is another bit where I appreciate she tells you to use a straight stitch to stitch this into place. You don't need to use a zigzag for this section because this is such a wide neckline, it's not going to be stretching and pulling over your head. It's just going to slip over. And using a straight stitch is going to make it neater and it's going to make sure that it's secure, that it shouldn't be tugging and pulling out of place and it should sit where it's supposed to. For this particular one, she also tells you to, rather than doing a back stitch at the sides, at the edges of the shoulders, to avoid having kind of messy, bulky looking stitches up there, to actually pull the threads through to the inside and tie them off with a knot, which I think is just a really nice finish. I love that she's thought about the outside, how it's gonna look, and trying to make it look as professional and neat as it possibly can. This particular fabric, I will say, was not a big fan of folding anywhere where you were trying to cross over the different colors. The black and white of this fabric are actually quite a different feel to them. The white is a bit thicker, I think, than the black, and you can fold it along the black and white lines if you need to, but if you're folding more of a diagonal, this section kind of bunches up when you're trying to fold it over. I don't know how obvious it's gonna be, but it was really difficult to get these to sit flat when I was trying to fold these sections, if I was ever trying to overlap the two colors. And so at the neckband, there was a section where I had to fold, try and show you here, I had to fold along and crossing over these black and white lines, and it did not want to sit flat. So I decided to add a little extra row of stitching. So that was not in the instructions. I did that just to make sure that my neckband sits really flat. And I think it looks fine. I think it's a very subtle little line there, and I don't think it's noticeable, but it's gonna mean that this is gonna sit a bit flatter when I'm wearing it. And I feel like this looks really professional. I honestly could not fault it. I think it looks great. I think it looks shop bought and it looks really beautiful. For the Love Notions Classic Tee, the overall instructions and construction were great. I really enjoyed sewing it. Really clear, easy instructions, great illustrations, no complaints with that on the whole. One thing that they did add in that I really loved was telling you about how you might want to adjust your band piece for the neckline. So as I said before, depending on what fabric you have, it may stretch more or it may stretch less. So making sure that it's going to fit into the neckline so that it's going to look nice and neat and flat against your skin is not that easy. So they gave you a little tip, which I really loved, where you take your neckband piece, mark the quarter sections of that, compare that to the shirt, and they've recommended that each quarter section should stretch about 1 inch to fit into the neck area and the neckline area. If it doesn't, you might need to make your neckband piece a little bit shorter or longer. Such a good tip. Loved how specific and clear that was. And as a result, could be a bit of luck, but it could be because of their instructions, this neckband looks so beautiful. I love how flat it sits. I feel like that went in really nice and neat, and I'm really impressed with that. The only thing I will say is when you're top stitching along that neckband, I did not like their instructions. So they said you can use a twin needle or a cover stitch, which is great, or a straight stitch. They don't recommend a zigzag, just a straight stitch. Now, there are different size neckbands for this, and there is a crew neckband that is definitely going to need to stretch over your head. You do not want to put a straight stitch on a part of a stretchy jersey fabric garment that is going to need to stretch because it's going to pop those seams. So I was not happy to see that instruction. Like I said before, I choose to do a zigzag stitch for the majority of my top stitching of my neckbands, and so that's what I did for this. I think it looks absolutely fine. I went off their instructions because I don't want to take chances of this top stitching, pulling and stretching over time, and I didn't want to mess around with a twin needle, and I don't have a cover stitch. So that is a better option, I would say, on the whole, and I was a little bit nervous to see that instruction for poor beginners who aren't going to know and might completely mess up their neckband. And the final part of constructing most garments is going to be the hems. So for t-shirts, you're going to have a sleeve hem and you're going to have a hem at the bottom of the shirt. I feel like the depth of the hem makes a big difference on how the final garment looks and how it sits. I, in my own experience, have found that shorter little hems at the bottom of the sleeve in particular roll up. Sometimes even at the bottoms of tops as well, they can roll up if they're not a very thick one. It's just to do with the nature of this type of fabric does tend to curl and roll, and so you want to try to avoid that doing as much as possible. So the Jennifer Lauren handmade gable top had the narrowest hem. It was just a little 3/8 of an inch hem that you're folding up and stitching into place. I will be honest, I'm anticipating when I wear this that it's going to curl up and drive me a little bit crazy. I'm hoping I'll be wrong. It is quite a lightweight fabric. If it's not pulled super taut, maybe I'll get away with it. But if I was making the shirt again, and if I was making it in a more of a like cotton jersey fabric, I would definitely make sure that I had a deeper hem on the sleeves. On the bottom of the shirt, it's exactly the same. So they're recommending that you roll that up 3/8 of an inch and stitch it down. As you can see, my fabric's already curling quite a bit, and I have a feeling it's not going to sit super flat at the bottom of this shirt as a result. We'll see when I put it on, but I'm just telling you my expectations. The Love Notions Classic Tee has a 1-inch hem for both. So you can see on the sleeve, it's definitely on the outside, it's a deeper hem. On the inside, you can see that it's nice and deep. It is curling just at the edges of the fabric, but that's not going anywhere because it is a deeper hem. Same with the bottom of the shirt. We've got a nice 1-inch deep hem, which I feel is going to be nice and secure and stay nice and flat against my body when I'm wearing it. The Concord Tea by Cashmere had the deepest, and they actually had a difference. So on the sleeve, they have a 1-inch hem, which I think is absolutely perfect, absolutely fine, looks nice and neat. And at the bottom of the shirt, they actually had a deeper 1.5-inch hem, which is quite a chunky, you should hopefully be able to see the difference. It's quite a chunky hem there. And on the inside, hopefully you can see that it's, you know, again, sitting nice and flat. I feel like the thicker the hemband, or the thicker the hem is rolled up, the more likely it is to stay flat. So as far as wearing these, my suspicion is the Love Notions Classic Tee and the Concord Cashmere Tee will both be absolutely fine. But I feel like I really like that chunky hem, just as far as the aesthetic look of it on the Concord Tee. I feel like it has a more professional finish. I like the way it looks. So we're gonna look at the leaderboard again now after all the information we've talked through. I feel like at the bottom of the leaderboard today has still got to be the Love Notions Classic Tee. I feel like there were some elements that disappointed me a little bit, particularly for a beginner sewer, and I feel like it just wasn't up to the same level of instructions as the others. It was pretty close between the other two, but I feel like there were more issues, things that I didn't like about the Concord Tee, so I think that's going to sit in the second place. And at the top again, we have the Gable top by Jennifer Lauren handmade. Now obviously, the biggest element is going to be how these things look on my body, what the fit is like, what the shape and silhouette are like. And that is what's going to come next time in part 4 of this Clash of the Patterns series. So please do make sure you're subscribed if you want to know where this series ends. It will be my next video. I always get excited towards the end of these series. It will be coming out sooner than my other videos have been, just because I'm really excited to put these shirts on and see what they're like. And I will show you some pictures of them on my body so you can know what the finished garments look like. So make sure you do come back and see this video. Give me a thumbs up if you're enjoying my series. I really love hearing from you guys. If you like getting into the nitty-gritty, I don't want to be boring people, but I really enjoy looking at these details myself. Please do leave me a comment down below your thoughts on these instructions. If you've had similar pros and cons from pattern instructions, it's really useful just to get feedback about other patterns for myself in the future as well. And I will see you all again before long. Bye!